Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Sarah Marshall, and I am the Executive Director of Teach Indy. I'm joined by a fabulous group of panelists this evening that are excited to discuss some data with you. We want this to be an interactive experience tonight, so please join us in the chat. Start by telling us who you are, how you're connected maybe to Teach Indy or to the education landscape here in Indianapolis or beyond. And then please don't forget to put any questions that you have for the panelists in the chat, because we're going to make sure that we carve out some time at the very end for Q&A. So with that, I'd love to tell you just a little bit about Teach Indy. Teach Indy is an education nonprofit here in Indianapolis that's focused on recruitment, development, rewarding, and supporting local educators like the ones we're going to be hearing from this evening. If you want to learn a little bit more about us, our website is there, teachindynow.org. I have the pleasure of co-moderating the panel this evening with my dear friend, Rangel Hathaway. And so, Rangel, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Rangel Hathaway. I'm the Executive Director for Teach Plus Indiana. We're a nonprofit that is based in the city as well as the state. We work to empower teacher voice both in the classroom as well as at the State House. And so I'm super excited to be a part of these conversations. Really truly believe that teachers should be helping make decisions and inform the conversations that are happening within the profession of education. So I have the distinct honor of getting to introduce the panelists tonight. Well, they'll introduce themselves, but two of which are actually alumni from our programs. So with that, I'm going to have you all introduce yourselves one by one. Go ahead, share who you are, where you teach, give your school a shout out. And I will start. We'll just go across the board here with Phoebe.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Ruise, and I am a fourth grade teacher at Paramount Cottage Home.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rangel. I'm the Executive Director of Adelante Schools. Shout out to Donnan Elementary and Middle School.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rahul Jyoti. I am the Chief Readiness Officer at Victory College Prep, and this is my 14th year at our school.
Great. And we have one other teacher, Alyssa, who's going to be joining us momentarily. She's going to be joining from Paramount School of Excellence from Brookside. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we're going to be spending our time together this evening. We're going to start our data series on really unpacking ILearn. And we've had recent data that's come out, and we really are interested in this panelist's reactions to what we're seeing with the data. So we're going to be looking at statewide data. Then we're going to unpack and look more closely at Marion County data, get our educators' reactions, and again, hold time for Q&A. So please feel free to drop those questions into the chat, and then we'll do a wrap up. I'll also preview that this is the first of 4 conversations. So you'll see on the left of the slide, the conversations we're set to have later this year on SAT, data that we see in the K-2 space, and then finally focusing on a specific subgroup, which is special education, and what data we have around that group.
So to start the conversation, I think we need to just start first off with, why do we analyze data? This conversation is not a gotcha. We're not trying to blame anyone for the scores that we're going to go through tonight, but we truly believe that data should drive instruction of how we continue to better understand how students are doing, what we can do to improve both our instruction and then their outcomes. So this is what our conversation is going to be based in, and then moving into, again, kind of setting the foundation for the ongoing series. If you want to go to the next slide. So what is ILearn? ILearn is our state test. We take it every year in the spring, and it is for grades 3 through 8. We receive the different data for school and individual student data in May and June, and then statewide, we get that information in July. This can be, I'm on the wrong slide, apologies. So why might we take this test? A lot of times, actually, federal dollars are connected to the scores that we receive through ILearn, right? And so it's something where we can come back to the Every Student Succeeds Act, where we're having some of those regulations. In order for us to receive dollars from the federal level, we have to do the test. And before ILearn existed, this test came into existence in 2019, but prior to that, it was ISTEP. So it's relatively new test. It's pre-COVID, but we'll get into some of the details about that later. And the idea is that we're basing this test off of the standards for ELA and for math, English language arts, for those who are not education minded. But the idea is that we can assist families and educators in being better able to understand the strengths and the gaps that our students have and address those needs accordingly. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, back one. Forward one. There we go. So this data, it highlights student proficiency both in reading and in math. And there are 4 scores, 2 which count as passing, that above proficiency or at proficiency, and 2 that are not passing, approaching proficiency and below proficiency. Both sections determine, both the math and the reading, they determine the average passing grade, both for districts and for the state. So this data has informed in past school and district level letter grades. It's informed teacher evaluation scores, and it's informed kind of what student supports look like. Again, meaty conversation that I'm hoping we'll start to touch on some of those pieces going forward. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Yep. And so as we think about why it's important for us to look at this data, we need to consider that the data that's gleaned from this assessment, it's imperative we're really taking note of how different subgroups are performing, so we really can understand how students are learning effectively. One benefit of No Child Left Behind, I know it's a contentious topic, was that it actually highlighted achievement gaps, which we previously didn't understand and couldn't identify. And so when we look at this assessment, we're able to dig down into how are certain student groups actually performing. And so tonight we're going to be looking at overall how all students are doing across our state, and then digging also into Black, Latino, and white student groups. All right. So to start off at a high level, we're going to just start looking at the state level information. So overall, this is how our students have fared, right, on our test. And as I mentioned before, 2019 was the first year for ILearn. And that was administered, and the state saw a major drop in test scores. We had went from 50% of students passing in iStep down to 37% of students passing in ILearn. Not a great score, and because of that, the state legislature actually said, whoa, we're going to hold harmless all of the students. Little did we know what the coming years would bring, but so then as we saw this, post in 2020, I'm sorry, can't talk too many 20s. 2020 saw no test administered because obviously COVID. And then as we started to work our way back to somewhat of a norm and coming back to how a normal year runs, 2021, we saw a drop, an 8.5 percentage point decrease from 2019. And then as we came into this year's scores, we just recently came out back at the summer, we saw a slight increase. And an increase is good, but even if the state continues to increase at this rate, it's going to still take 4 years for us to get back to proficiency levels of 2019, which again, were not great if we recall at the beginning. And so with that in mind, I want to take it one step further, digging deeper into the actual subgroups, which you'll see here. And Alyssa just joined. We'll have you introduce yourself in a second. With our subgroups, this paints an even more dire picture, especially for our Black and Brown students when it comes to their performance. So again, you can see kind of the percentage of the student population in that first column, and then their proficiency scores, again, for both math and ELA through 2019 to 2022. And so you'll see consistently we've seen drops, and then only in the last year have we seen an increase. But even for our majority population of white students, we're seeing in the gains, they're very minimal. And so this is painting, again, kind of a not great picture of how we're doing in the sense of recovery back to pre-pandemic test scores. So with that in mind, my question to the panelists is, what stands out about this statewide data, about the subgroup data statewide? And we can actually go back to that last slide so that folks can kind of see it and respond. So what stands out to you all about the data that we just laid out?
I'd love to plug in here, if I don't mind, though. Alyssa, hi. Nice to see you. Can we give some time for Alyssa to introduce herself before I share my thoughts?
Eddie, thank you for keeping me on
No
ball.
worries.
So Alyssa, go ahead, share who you are, what school you teach, what you teach. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eddie. Yes, my name is Alyssa Brelage. I am a 4th grade teacher at Paramount Brookside.
Great. I didn't want to start my comments until we met Alyssa. So I think there are a couple of things that this brings up. Again, I shared at the very top of the panel that I am an executive director. I'm at a school leader level. And one thing I want to say before we dig into this is that this is not the singular picture. And I think Rachel and Sarah have said this multiple times. This is not the singular picture of our students. However, this is the way that we can hold ourselves accountable in the state of Indiana to make sure the singular fact that our children can read and write and do math on grade level is true. And so regardless of how any folks in Indiana feel about standardized assessments, this is a marker of whether or not we are delivering on the promise to our families when children step foot in our schools. Are we actually educating your children? And as this story so blatantly puts out in front of all of us, there are some students who are learning and there are those who are not. And I think the first thing, Rachel, you mentioned the statewide drop the first year of ILearn. I hate to call it a bright spot, but there are also national assessments that are given, such as NAEP, that when we compare NAEP scores to the first year of ILearn scores, they were much more closely aligned, which painted a picture for me as a school leader that, hey, this assessment is rigorous and we are holding a higher bar for our students, and we're not lying to families and saying they're prepared for college, they're prepared for careers. So I think from, again, a spot of brutal truths, it showed us what our kids are actually capable of doing, and then it created a sense of urgency within all of us. I think the bigger picture here, when we look at this slide of subgroup pass rates, it's continuing the narrative that because of your racial or ethnic background, it's almost predetermined what our school system is doing or educating for our Black and Latino students. And so it's continuing the narrative of, if you are a Black or Latino student, you are 20% more likely to not, when compared to your white peers, to be proficient in reading and math per your grade level standards in the state of Indiana. And so it again calls us to action, especially those of us in classrooms, the boots on the grounds every day, what we need to do, especially for our children who are Black and Latino.
I just wanted to add one point that kind of Eddie brought up that kind of leads into what I was thinking of as well. He mentioned like the sense of urgency. And I think that when we look at the data and look at the numbers and how there is such a slight point of growth, it just really brings home for, like you said, as classroom teachers, the importance of and the critical nature of tracking data and of using data each and every day. And so I think that we all kind of knew already that data was important, but kind of looking at these numbers really proves to teachers how not only through like standardized testing and things of that nature, but day-to-day classroom functions that are based in data-driven instruction are even more critical than ever based on these numbers.
Great. Anyone else have any last comments before we move forward? Okay.
Emphasizing again, I was going to say that this is statewide data, and so we'll be getting even more into. So I think that this does tell an experience of our state that, again, what is that saying to Black and brown families, that 8.1% of their students in 2021 could read and do math, right? So I think it also has to do somewhat, as we think about workforce, there is a tell at the state level, well, why would someone want to move into Indiana? If their test scores look that abysmal, is it really a place for everyone, or is it just for a certain demographic? And so, sorry, that was my final comment. If there's any other thoughts that folks want to add, we can keep moving otherwise. Great. Sarah, throwing it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. That's a really helpful transition. So thank you for talking about that really like wider lens piece about the full state of Indiana. Now we're going to spend some time focused on Marion County. For those of you that are joining us that maybe aren't from Indiana, Marion County specifically is in the center of Indianapolis, and we have 11 townships and districts that we're going to be looking at data for this evening. We also have a fairly large charter group that we are going to kind of roll their data all together and take a look at that as their own district, if you will, as we're kind of taking a look at the data. And again, similar to what we saw across the state data, I think that we're seeing some glimpses of positives, but also want to be really transparent and open about the places that we're not seeing such great returns and great scores, so that we can continue to move ourselves forward and do better for the students that are in front of us. So let's start by taking a look at Marion County data and the overall picture of how students performed across the 11 schools in our district. So the positive, we'll start with the positive. 10 of the 11 school districts and the independent charter schools as a district saw an increase in their overall proficiency rates from the 2021 ILearn data that we just saw then in 2022. So you'll see in the map to the right a breakdown visually of how each of the different townships performed. One thing that you'll see across all of these maps is that depending on where we are, the data looks very different across the various districts. And so it's important that we are just naming again that this isn't a point or pit one group versus the other. It's really just we have to be able to be willing to take a look at the data before we can meaningfully move forward. So again, this is the overall pass rate across Marion County. And then we're going to look at some subgroup data as well. So the first group we're going to be looking at is our Black student population. So again, similar to Marion County, the scores really vary across the city of Indianapolis. But what you'll see is we have lots of scores that are significantly lower than the overall scores, which tells us that we're not having a lot of success, or that our Black students are not seeing the same levels of success as perhaps the overall data that we're seeing across the county. Again, a positive here is we did have 8 of the 11 school districts see an increase in their data from 2021 to 2022, but similar to the state data, we're moving at such a slow increase or slow clip that if we aren't able to start to increase the way that we're closing that gap, it's going to take us a very long time for Black students in particular to meet their the overall Marion County average, let alone where we want them to be from a proficiency perspective. And so the last subgroup that we're going to be looking at today, again, we're looking at and analyzing just strictly based on race and ethnicity today, is how our Marion County students, our Latino students, did across the sector. Similar to the Black students, we did have 8 of our 11 school districts and the independent charters that saw an increase in their data from 2021 to 2022. And just like the previous, we see varying levels of proficiency across the various townships. But again, all performing, or all scores indicating that our Latino students are not performing at the same levels as the overall performance. And if it's helpful, I love that Rachel helped us to kind of give us another modality to see this data. So if you're more interested in looking at this as a chart, you'll see here our overall pass rates, and then Black students, Latino students, and we've also included how their white peers performed on the assessment as well, to kick off our conversation with our teachers and with our panelists. So with that, super curious for you all, what are you thinking about, or what stands out to you about either the maps or the table here that's showing how Marion County is doing, either compared to the state or just within Marion County, if we're just looking at that data. So I'll throw it open to the group.
I can go first. I think the first thing that sticks out to me when we look at all this data is just the variance between all of the different townships. If you're not from Indianapolis, all these townships are minutes from each other. And I think just going back to why looking at data is so important, there's definitely some outliers here in a positive. And I think there's a lot to be learned from certain schools that are having success, maybe with the student population, as opposed to other schools that are maybe not having success. And I think as we continue to come together to try to get all of these scores up, I definitely think there's an area of opportunity for us to look to different school districts that are having success with certain populations and see what are they doing that we can transfer over to other districts.
I also, maybe it relates a little bit back towards the statewide data, but seeing these numbers really resonates with me because it really just brings things close to home. And as an educator, that's exactly what I care about. I care about the students that are going to be in my classroom and how I'm going to get them to achieve what they need to achieve. When I look at these numbers, to be honest, I'm a little bit overwhelmed as an educator because it really paints a picture of who I'm going to have in my classroom that's actually ready and has access to grade level content, which we know is incredibly important to be teaching, of course, in your grade level. And so I just wanted to kind of name the fact that as an educator, when you look at this, my immediate reaction is slightly being slightly overwhelmed, but also just knowing that I'm really going to need to equip myself with knowledge of the grade levels prior. And I'm really going to need to make sure that I have a really deep content knowledge in what students should have been learning that they might not have mastered yet, because I'm going to be needing to do a lot of remediation in order to urgently get them where they need to be at the end of the year.
Thanks so much for that, Phoebe and Rahul. I really appreciate your connection to also thinking about how we lean into sharing positive, sharing bright spots, sharing resources when things are going well. How do we open up our classrooms to be learning spaces or open up our schools so that we can learn from each other is going to be so critical in how we really move all of us forward. Because again, I speak from all of us or for all of us when I say like all students, regardless of what schools they're in, really are our students. And so we want to make sure that everyone is moving in that positive direction forward. So what I'd love for us to do, Eddie, go ahead. I know you have something to say, which is awesome.
Yeah. Whenever we look at data like this to segregate it, I think this is really powerful for parents and families to look at as well. Because there are sometimes these narratives of excellent schools or excellent models, or the greener grass on the other side, which township is better to get your student into. And while there are bright spots in different townships, we have to continuously ask the question, who are these schools serving? And this is one of those, I'll keep using the term, the brutal truths. This will share who are these schools serving? Are they serving all students equitably, or are there widening gaps? And I also think, being an educator in Indianapolis, a lot of times there is this thought that Indiana is Indianapolis. And there are many more kids who, are around Indianapolis in townships that we need to be focused on as well, and really take the amount of urgency and concern that we have here in Indianapolis, Center Township, for our broader community and all kids in Indiana. And so again, this kind of data that is so, lovely put up in front of us, where we can look and make correlations between different townships and districts. It begets the question, who are the schools serving?
Were you all familiar with this data and seeing it in this way? Because I feel like I've experienced where I've shown data to my teachers and they're like, whoa, I didn't even know that this was like something I could look at or where to access this.
I can speak for myself personally. The organization that I work for really does value data, and it is regularly shown to us. Really mainly as a motivator to say, hey, we know that we're not doing something right across the state, or there's room for opportunity to be better. And we want to be at the forefront of that change. And so it is kind of an example of how a school can utilize data that otherwise can be kind of a little bit of a downer, as a way to provide motivation for educators, for students, and families alike.
I'm sorry, I've talked a lot, but Phoebe just illuminates something too. Yeah, this should be a community rallying cry, really, and a township and a statewide rallying cry of this can't fall on the shoulders of educators solely. It simply can't, because as we see, this is too much of a task to say, okay, you've got your kids for 1 year, teacher, go out and prosper, or good luck. It's got to be an entire community effort, and it can't rely solely on our educators.
Great. We're going to talk a little bit about how to engage families and the community with this data. So Eddie, thanks for that kind of prompt forward. I also, Phoebe, appreciate your transparency around being a teacher and maybe even an early career teacher and seeing this data and going like, whoa, what do I do now? What's that first step that I can take? So we'd love to start to move into some questions that we have for you all. Kind of maybe focused first on, let's look at the data purely and think, how are you all leveraging this in practice? So Eddie, from your seat as an executive director, Rahul, leading and supporting and coaching teachers, and then Alyssa and Phoebe both doing some support of teachers, but also in your classrooms. Let's just kick off some questions. And again, I'm gonna plug the chat one more time. We do want to make sure that we hold time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, folks that are listening, don't be afraid to add those to the chat for our educators as well. So maybe the first question that we have here is, how do you or your school use data like ILearn in the classroom? And perhaps are there other data sets that are beneficial for you as you're working with students? And I'll throw this open to whomever would like to start.
I can definitely jump in and start. I really think that with the data that we're looking at, we know that we're going to have a very wide range of learners, and it's completely essential that we have really deep content knowledge as educators. So specifically, really equipping yourself with knowledge of the standards, because in order to see those test scores obviously increase, we need to make sure that we're teaching the standards and also the rigor that the standards require. In addition to that, we have the added task of trying to balance out some of our learners that have gaps. And we're going to need to know pretty specifically, what those gaps could potentially be. And that might require you to also have pretty strong knowledge of the grade level below you. And so I know that the DOE or the IDOE has a lot of resources. Specifically, I would really leverage the vertical standard articulations to understand what were they supposed to be learning the year before. How does that compare to what you are trying to teach them in your grade level? And then providing within your lessons multiple access points so that all of your students have some sort of opportunity to be successful, so that you're able to push them into a way that they can grow and ultimately reach that grade level benchmark by the end of the year. And I have to really, really reiterate the fact that what I just said sounds great. It is not an easy task. It is juggling out the wazoo, and it is literally, you have 12 balls in the air at once. So it's a very difficult task. And to Eddie's point, it takes a community, not just a simple professional development for a teacher. It takes a community to help that teacher juggle. And that teacher needs to feel empowered to juggle. And we need to have a school system, a parent ally, just in general, a whole community of people really supporting and rallying on the students and the teachers.
Go ahead, Alyssa.
I was just going to add on a point to what Phoebe said, which I really liked about the vertical articulation standards, and how connecting that also to beginning of year data, those results has been really helpful for my classroom and my grade level team. Just figuring out where are we at beginning of year with some of the gaps that maybe the students didn't reach by end of year for my situation in third grade, and then using that vertical articulation to then figure out what is my starting scaffolding point, where I need to kind of address this gap before I can get into the grade level content. So connecting that really great resource then to hard data that we have with our students to be able to then curriculum map and plan effectively so that the grade level content we're putting in front of them, the kids feel confident with and have had that scaffolding to kind of close that gap that they might be experiencing.
And I was going to jump a little bit to the second question, Sarah. I think if you're not an educator, you might be thinking, okay, why is the 3rd through 8th grade test? How does it affect us, or how does it affect the bigger picture here in the state? I work in my role with students that are all the way through 12th grade, and then even with our graduating alumni for multiple years, and helping them to just be a positive impact on the community. And one of the things we see is when you see data like this, it leads to students not being able to perform as well in the SAT, national tests, and then not being able to be as successful in college. And as the state has released over the summer, a lot of the Indiana college going rates are lower than ever before. Those rates are continuing to go down, and there's less and less students that are prepared to take on these new jobs that are going to be available. So I think if you're someone that's not in education, this use of data and trying to increase the proficiency for 3rd through 8th graders does end up going down the pipeline. It's something that we're trying to do as a school, is once you have students in 9th grade, how do you prepare them to be successful after they graduate and beyond? But this is the starting point. Whether a student, I think Eddie said at the beginning, if a student can read, write, and do math at a proficient level in 8th grade, they're way more likely to be able to do that by the time they graduate high school and beyond. And I think investing as much as we can into these younger students just will help our community long term as we prepare those students to become successful adults here in our community.
Yeah, and Sarah, I know that at the very top of the panel, you mentioned that we're going to be focusing on K2 students a little bit later in the series, which I'm very passionate about, because I think a lot of times our state looks at 3rd grade teachers like, what did you do? Well, it was actually the foundations that, were shaky. We were building houses on quicksand sometimes. And so it begs the question of what are we doing early on, even pre-K, where we're setting kids up for success. I think for the second question here, what other data sets are important? We have to remember that ILearn is a singular snapshot given at the end of the year. And so schools, I know excellent schools like VCP and Paramount, both schools that are represented here, are constantly looking at data through progress monitoring tools, giving interim assessments, making sure that we are constantly keeping a pulse on what our students are understanding from our instruction. And then, turning around and saying, okay, we see this grade level trend or a school-wide trend where we need to address or we need to plug into, and creating explicit, systematic opportunities for students to then address those gaps. And again, from like a school-wide lens, wrapping support around students in mastering those grade level standards, whether that be looking at vertical articulation standards and saying, hey, it was actually 2 grade levels beforehand where they didn't have the number sense mastery that they needed. And that's why we're seeing this in 4th grade, so on and so forth. So I think it's really important for schools, and especially I'm talking to school leaders out there, to protect your teachers' time to look at the data and then create the time for them to address what they need to address. Because as Phoebe stated, there are many balls being juggled in a classroom outside of just looking at data and making sure children are learning. And so we have to be fierce protector of teachers' time and create opportunities for those pulse checks throughout the year so that we're not caught at the end of the year saying, I guess our students didn't know this. And creating systems for that in our schools.
And I can speak a little bit to, what that actually looks like on the ground level in terms of looking at data frequently and how it actually happens across the school year. Just like Eddie said, ILearn is a snapshot of grade level standards at the end of the year, and it's not enough to just look at those numbers. And so really great practices that have been put into place are to have basically interim assessments that mirror ILearn that you can have your students take at the end of the year, middle of the year, and beginning of the year. That's an additional point of data that you're able to use as an educator to see if your practice is working, and then more importantly, change your practice if it's not working or it's not getting the results that you need. But then it goes even further than that, where you should be looking at weekly data, understanding that you have a weekly standard that's going to build up over time, assessing that, and being able to even compare it from class level or class to class, and giving opportunities for teachers to collaborate and compare, saying, your class really mastered that singular standard, mine didn't. What did you do that I can learn from you so that I can go back and remediate? And also just using that data, not necessarily as a gotcha, but as an opportunity to grow as an educator.
Yeah, that was a great point that you made, Phoebe. I was going to say the same thing, that just the weekly data tracking has been really successful, just to see what those power standards are that we're covering and do the kids get it. But then even as I track interventions and the result of working with students with individual interventions, I'm also tracking those as well, and making decisions based off of what supports am I giving this student, looking at 5 different assessment points. Are they making progress? And if not, then let's change that intervention. If they are making progress, let's continue with that intervention. And so that's also another way that I have been able to kind of use that data to make those kinds of decisions in the classroom.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And Alyssa and Phoebe, I especially appreciate having that like really clear picture of what an educator might, start with, from like daily monitoring of an exit ticket or of the standard, right, to building that to a weekly, which is so important. I think I want to move us to this third question, because we've heard some great practices already of what you're doing in the classroom, but can you share with us a little specifics on how are you leveraging subgroup data in particular? We saw the data on the slides and we know that our groups of students are performing differently. How are you using this data to really close that achievement gap? What are those like steps that you're taking in the classroom to make sure that we're moving the achievement gap, minimizing, that achievement gap?
I can lead us off here. I think one of the areas we haven't talked on as much, but is definitely an important part of our community, is our students and families. So I think that something that I did in my classroom I taught 8th grade math last year, and for many years, something we do in our building, I think a lot of the other schools that on here do, is sharing this data and information with families and students. I think our families send their students to our schools, and if they don't hear from us very often, they just assume everything's going well. And then over the summer, the student comes home and they go to the next grade and they just assume, hey, we're moving on. And that's something that we've tried to do a little more of, is sharing data with students, specifically as in my role in terms of getting ready for college, sharing that data with our older students to share what does it mean in your specific subgroup in terms of going to college, and how does that relate to ILearn. But I definitely think that that's something that we can do to help close that achievement gap, is making sure parents and students understand the subgroup data they're a part of, and what they need to do to have that sense of urgency to close that gap. Because I think a lot of times, if our parents and families don't know the actual data, they are not going to make a change that they might need to change, just like we as educators need to make changes.
Another thing that I would kind of want to plug in there is the fact that, you as a data-oriented educator might be running data in multiple ways. Always include the subgroup data, and constantly be looking at that alongside just general proficiency, and have someone else look critically at it with you and just ask the question, why? If you're seeing, that your EL learners or just are lower, have another educator take a look and say, is there something that I can do to give these students better access? You wouldn't know to ask those questions if you didn't always pull out that subgroup and show it alongside the general population. So I would say it would be my push for educators. You can do it in your own classroom, but also schools, to say that we should be pulling out subgroup data basically at all points. because we do have a variety of learners that are going to need different things.
So y'all have tied into transition nicely into our next set of questions, which really focuses in on kind of exactly what you've raised, right? Like next steps for an educator. So there may be some teachers on here who are like, I am completely new to looking at data, still don't quite understand what I'm doing. Or there's those veterans who are just looking for other ways to like think about data. So while we've talked about a little bit in the sense of like parent and community engagement, we could probably skip that one, but if anyone has any additional thoughts, we're really going to dive into, I think, more about like how are we helping families understand that data? Because again, to Rahul, your point, when we're talking to the students and we're saying, hey, this is where you are, and this is what we need to do to get up to this point, as educators, what can we help our teachers do to help them then help our parents understand, right? Like there's that full pipeline. So thoughts on that?
I think my initial thought is really just we need increased transparency and also a next level of honesty when it comes to interactions between teachers and parents. I know as a result of COVID, I've had a lot of parents, directly ask me or express concern that they're not really sure, if the COVID gap is still impacting their kids, or they're just in general unsure, quite frankly, if it is impacting their kids. And I think it's just really important for educators to feel empowered to say, we are the professionals and we are the people who can say whether or not we feel like this child is achieving at grade level. And we need to be able to honestly communicate that to our parents because they're not going to know otherwise. They're not licensed teachers. They haven't received the same education and training that we have. And so we have to be very clear and we have to really kind of not sugarcoat it and say, you know what, there are still gaps within your child's knowledge. These are the gaps that I'm seeing. This is what I'm going to try and do to address those gaps, but I'm probably going to need your help. And it would be very beneficial for you to be working on your child with, X, Y, and Z. And I think having those conversations early on in the year is going to be super powerful. But also we need to be really backing our teachers and knowing that those conversations are of extreme urgency right now because we need that community to feel rallied around our students. And also we need a little bit of help and support for our teachers as well who are trying to serve our students.
And I think that kind of relates to the point that was made earlier about how the data can feel kind of overwhelming, even to teachers looking at. And I can't imagine not being in the education field and looking at that and the kind of overwhelming sense that I would get. So, and I know my organization does a really good job of breaking the data into like very small pieces so that it is easily digestible, not just by teachers, but then so that teachers can kind of explain to families like, this is exactly the point that we're working on. Here are things that you can do at home with your student. Just to make it not feel so overwhelming and not so the data is like getting lost in all of the different vocabulary that families are seeing. So being intentional about breaking that data up for families and being able to be well versed in it to really have a good, like transparent conversation about what it exactly means in terms of a family working with their student.
Eddie, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to jump in here. What does this look like at a school level, right? When you think about helping share this with families, how is Adelante schools thinking about delivering this information or sharing this with families?
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Phoebe said. From a school perspective, it's actually supporting our teachers to have really tough conversations and painting sharing the short term of where your child stands, and then painting a long-term picture, saying what opportunities are they going to be prevented from accessing because of, if we continue to push this off, continue to push it off. Yes, it's only third grade. And I put that in air quotes. Yes, it's third grade. I know I'm talking to you like this is college and it's like make it or break it time, but it actually is, because it will just compound itself year over year if we're not sharing honestly with families where their students are at and what we can all collectively do to make sure that their students are prepared for any opportunity that they want post leaving Adelante schools or post leaving any of our schools. So I think it's supporting teachers to have those conversations and then being unashamed to say, we are keeping the classroom a sacred space because every child deserves to read, write, and do math on grade level. I think a lot of times, I get from a school level, we're so focused on what they're learning, and we have to create more opportunities for them to be kids. I agree. And children should love school. They should be excited to dig into the next book or do a STEM activity where they're learning mathematical concepts. And then saying to families, yes, but you send your children to our school to learn and to be educated. And so we're also going to heavily focus on this. I think from a school level, you have to start out the gate, especially new families who might not be used to all of the data and the progress monitoring things, just saying this is exactly why we're doing this. Because we would never want to fool you into coming to a school saying that we're going to make sure your child is prepared at the end of their grade level, and then turn around and say, oh, we're going to have a different conversation about keeping them in the grade level because we actually haven't been honest with you, or because, we haven't used all the time that has been given to us with your child. And I think, again, we're in this moment of urgency because of the pandemic, but if we're not lying to ourselves, we've been in this state of emergency for a long time in our country. And so now it's heightened, and I think everyone is more aware of it, especially because parents became teachers in 2020 and they were like, wait, this is what it's like to teach. And I've got 2 or 3 of them and teachers have 30 of them. So I know I just threw a lot of words out, but it's really supporting our teachers, being brutally honest, and then saying there is hope. Here's what we're doing day in and day out, every minute of the school day to support your child in making true whatever they want to be true.
And I would just jump in to kind of echo Eddie's point from a school perspective. Even just in this 1 hour, there's been a ton of data. So I think one of the things that we need to do as school leaders and teachers is just pick those few data points that and kind of are the most enlightening that we can use. So that's something we've started using, is not even using graduation rates, but using things like matriculation, which is the percent of students that are going to college, or grade point average in terms of high school. So I think as school leaders, we need to really simplify for our teachers and for our community, what are the data points we're using so that we're not overwhelming our school community. It's hard enough to be a teacher if you're throwing 20 different data points at them and then they have to share 20 data points with all their students and families. That's too much. So I think as a school leader, we need to look at all those data points and then just kind of pick where are the ones that we're going to focus on in our conversations with our teachers, families, and students, to really kind of all gather around and have that same focus and energy to changing it.
Rahul, I really appreciate you raising that, because to the conversation we're having, like, it can be overwhelming. And so finding like the grounding data that you can say, this is what we're driving toward. And I also think in a landscape where, folks will say, we teach to the test. That's what we're doing. There's too much testing. I think, again, it comes back to like, well, when we're looking at explicitly, we know what we're monitoring and why it's important. That is so essential. Which then leads us kind of to our next question of, and I'm going to encourage folks to drop things in the chat if you all have things to share, but what is one tool, resource, or support you might recommend to teachers interested in better leveraging data to inform their instruction going forward?
I think it all starts with, grade level standards, knowing exactly what you're supposed to be teaching and having a deep knowledge in that. I've mentioned already utilizing the vertical articulations, knowing that we're going to have some students that are slightly below grade level and need access and support in that way. But there's also a wealth of resources on the IDOE website where they help you break down standards, understand, the rigor of what they're asking you to do, and even have released items that you're able to sample, and you yourself can take an assessment just as a fourth grader would to understand, what's being asked of your students. I feel like the IDOE is an amazing resource if you dig through all the resources and really kind of try and pick through it all. And it's all free. So any person who is wanting to implement this, even if you're feeling like you might be one of the only teachers in your building trying to really start this initiative, you can start basically for free by looking at the IDOE website and trying to leverage some of the resources they have, and then hopefully spreading that knowledge to the other teachers within your building.
Don't be shy. If there are other tools, strategies, resources, or we can keep moving. Feel free to drop stuff in the chat if you're like, hey, yeah, here's a link to something. Feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to move us to the final question, because then we can open it up to our Q&A, which for folks who are tuning in, be sure to drop those questions in the chat box and we'll try to address those. So coming back to kind of where we started this conversation with our subgroups, and kind of, again, speaking to these disparities in the sense of our achievement data, what is one actions teachers might take to specifically leverage that data to better close those achievement gaps going forward between students of different races, right? So knowing our subgroup data, and we kind of dug into this a little bit more, but what is, again, maybe one concrete next step that if a teacher left today, they could take right away?
I'll jump in here, and I'm not sure if it's an action to specifically leverage data to better close the achievement gap. But it is an action that I think as a teacher, someone mentioned to me, and I was like, oh yeah, that sounds wise, because you've got a lot of stuff going on as a teacher. Take the ILearn released items and actually take the ILearn yourself, whatever grade level you're teaching. I think that's an easy way to start. Experience what it feels like for a kid and think about the things that kids are going to have to know and be able to do in order to answer the questions that they're being asked to prove that they are mastering their grade level content. I think that was one of the most eye-opening experiences as a teacher, and something that I know probably all of the schools on this panel do is encourage the teachers to actually take it and feel it, because then you're able to speak a lot more honestly about the experience of what a student will see on ILearn. And I don't know if that answers the leveraging data, but it is something that might be eye-opening if someone hasn't done it yet.
And I think to piggyback on that, which all of this is on the DOE, the Indiana DOE's website. If you just Google ILearn, you can find it on the homepage. Similar to that, the release items, I would highly recommend everyone look at their item specifications, which is basically by standard, all of the different types of questions that you would see. So if you're teaching 8th grade math, every single standard has example questions. It's similar to what Eddie said. When I taught 8th grade math, before I started a unit, I would look at all of those questions and just kind of go through them myself. And I do think it does help close that achievement gap, because basically what we're doing as teachers is making sure we're teaching at a rigor level that is equal to that test, and not holding the fact that maybe these students didn't perform as well last year against them, giving them that opportunity to meet the rigor that it needs to be at for this year, which is something that is very difficult to do as a teacher. But using those resources on the DOE, the released items and the item specifications can help make that a lot easier for you and know exactly what to focus on.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for the discussion here. We have put a couple of resources in, and we are going to come to a resource page here for teachers here in just a minute. I think we do have one question that we want to make sure that we take some time to address. So let's see what that question was. Thanks, Mia, for sending this one along. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Thanks for the time for the discussion. I'm someone who spends a lot of time looking at data, but who doesn't have a classroom background. So it's been helpful to hear your perspective. When you get the data each year, especially disaggregated by subgroup, how do you determine what part of your model or curriculum are working well, and then what parts might need to be adjusted in order to better serve students? So again, Mia, that's a great question. Anyone want to approach that one?
I feel like the answer to this comes with just understanding how to utilize the resources within your school. I'm going to kind of defer back to what I had said before, where a teacher is being asked to do a lot of things and juggle a lot of balls. And realistically, we need a whole team of people to help them achieve that. So whenever, the data is disaggregated and there's something that's, either showing that, hey, this teacher or this person's doing an amazing job, and then this teacher might be struggling with that same concept, connecting those two teachers and allowing them to just naturally support each other would be an amazing thing. Likewise, there's also a lot of, supports that do exist within schools, like, for example, guidance counselors. Really equipping teachers to understand, I'm looking at my data and I'm able to identify 2 to 3 students that I think could benefit from that service, and creating a system with your school model or your school system that allows teachers to really connect those students with the guidance counselors in a powerful way is important. And similarly, I'm thinking about something like attendance. Oftentimes there's someone within the administration office staff that manages attendance and reports attendance, trying to also provide teachers with, a pipeline or an understanding of how can you reach out and leverage additional resources to help you even with something like that. So I would say, if you're thinking about how the data can help inform like a school model, to me, it's all rooted in resources and clear communication and codification of how teachers can actually utilize and access those resources.
And then I can kind of speak on just the connection to curriculum mapping and content planning using this data. So something that I found to be really useful is to use that data in conjunction with my curriculum map and looking at where students have kind of missed the mark, and then being really intentional about providing not only just scaffolding options, but also extension options that deal with that specific standard to give students the most ample opportunity to practice and master the skill. And then also just making note of common misconceptions that can be talked about like the next year when we start our curriculum map, kind of like forward planning and thinking about what do we really need to hit hard from the beginning based on this data and based on how historically our students have performed with this skill. And that just helps for good intentional planning.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alyssa, for that. And I think you all have illuminated some really great resources. So I'm actually going to transition us forward to share. We do have some resources that we're going to drop in the chat. Many of them have already been mentioned this evening. So the IDOE, again, has a lot of free resources for teachers that are just getting started or those that maybe have been in the classroom for a while. So we have some testing resources available. We also have an ILearn result overview in both English and Spanish that helps to really frame the maps that we were looking at earlier. And another blog post that's focused on kind of the progress that we've made so far. And an important piece that we've talked about tonight, like the perspective of parents, right? And making sure that we recap and are sharing this data with parents. The last resource is pretty incredible, and one that I was just recently shared was this. There's a free resource from 5-Star that allows you to compare year-over-year data for how schools and systems are doing. So we'll make sure that we drop the link in the chat for that as well. If there was a question that didn't get answered this evening, we encourage you to send us an email and we will continue this great conversation. The good news is it's not over after tonight, as we mentioned. So coming up in the next couple of weeks, actually, I guess next couple of months, our next teacher talk isn't going to be in November 15th. And we're going to be digging into the SAT in a very similar fashion to how we looked at ILearn today and figuring out what's that data telling us about our high school students that are getting ready to transition into college, career, and beyond. I want to say thank you, a huge thank you to our panelists of experts. Thank you for all that you do to support students and for all the incredible knowledge that you just shared with those of us that were watching. Saw lots of good engagement today, and I know that this will continue long after this session. So again, a huge thanks to all of our schools that are here and represented. If you want to follow us on social media, there are all of the hashtags or all the Twitter accounts if you want to give us all a follow. And again, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening to dig into this important topic and conversation. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks, everyone.